On the night of August 20th, 1942, a Japanese colonel led 800 of his best soldiers across an airfield on a small jungle island in the Pacific, and every single one of them was dead before sunrise, and the man who planned the ambush that killed them was not a general directing the battle from a command post miles behind the lines, but was a lieutenant colonel with a rifle battalion who had figured out something about Japanese tactical doctrine that nobody else in the American military had yet fully understood, and who had spent the previous 24 hours deliberately constructing a killing ground so perfectly designed to exploit that understanding that the Japanese colonel walked his entire force into it without any warning at all, and without any indication that what he was about to do was anything other than the kind of successful night assault that he and his soldiers had executed against every other opponent they had faced, and the battle that followed lasted less than 4 hours and changed everything about how the Pacific War was going to be fought for the next 3 years. To understand what happened on that night, and why it matters, you need to understand where Guadalcanal fit in the broader Pacific War in August of 1942, and how genuinely desperate the American position actually was at that moment, because the popular narrative of the Pacific War as it has been told in the decades since the war ended tends to present the American victory as something that was essentially inevitable from the moment Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and that narrative is not simply incomplete, but is almost completely wrong in its characterization of what the actual strategic situation looked like to the people who were making decisions in Washington and in the Pacific in the summer of 1942. Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, and had followed that attack with a cascade of military successes across the Pacific and Southeast Asia that was almost without precedent in the speed and the completeness with which it unfolded. In the 4 months following Pearl Harbor, Japan had captured the Philippines and Malaya and Singapore and Burma and the Dutch East Indies and Wake Island and Guam, and had extended its defensive perimeter across an enormous arc of the Western Pacific in ways that made the prospect of reversing those conquests seem to many observers like an undertaking that would require a decade of sustained effort and cost 1 million American lives before it was completed. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 had been a genuinely decisive American victory that eliminated 4 Japanese fleet carriers in a single afternoon, and with them the experienced naval aviators who had spent years learning how to fly from carrier decks, and who could not be replaced quickly enough to restore the strike capability that Japan had lost. But Midway had not reversed the fundamental strategic situation in which Japan held an enormous defensive advantage in the form of an island chain that extended across thousands of miles of ocean, and that would have to be assaulted from the sea at enormous cost in ships and men at each position that the Americans needed to take in order to push the Japanese defensive perimeter back toward the home islands. The debate within the American military establishment in the summer of 1942 about how to take the strategic offensive against Japan without first building up the enormous forces that a fully resourced campaign would eventually require produced a decision to launch an improvised invasion of Guadalcanal in August 1942 with forces that were barely adequate to the task under the best possible conditions, and that were committed to the operation without the logistical support that would have given the initial landing force a reasonable margin for error if the Japanese response was faster or stronger than anticipated. Guadalcanal was a jungle island in the Solomon Islands chain that Japan had been developing as an airbase, and the Americans needed to seize it before that airbase became operational, because an operational Japanese airfield on Guadalcanal would extend Japanese air coverage over the sea lanes between the United States and Australia and potentially threaten the supply and communication lines that kept Australia in the war as an Allied base, and that were essential to any eventual offensive toward Japan. The Marines who landed on Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942 were going in with approximately half the supplies they needed, because the transport ships carrying the rest of the supplies had been pulled back when Japanese naval forces threatened the invasion fleet in ways that the escorting American warships felt unable to counter at that moment. They were also going in to hold a perimeter around an uncompleted airfield against an enemy that had demonstrated in every engagement of the previous 8 months that it was a more experienced and more tactically skilled opponent than anything the Americans had yet fielded in the Pacific, and that had been fighting in jungle terrain in China and Southeast Asia for years, while the Marines were learning how to do it for the first time in an environment that was genuinely unlike anything there. Training had prepared them for in terms of the density of the vegetation and the difficulty of movement and the effects of the tropical climate on men who were trying to maintain military effectiveness in temperatures and humidity levels that degraded physical performance far faster than anyone had anticipated. The Japanese force that was moving toward the American perimeter on Guadalcanal in the 3rd week of August 1942 was under the command of Colonel Kiyono Ichiki, and it was not a hastily assembled garrison unit or a collection of poorly trained soldiers thrown together to defend an isolated island outpost. It was among the finest infantry that Japan had available in the Pacific theater at that moment in the war, soldiers who had been selected and trained specifically for elite assault operations. and who had developed over years of training and actual combat against Chinese and Southeast Asian opponents a level of tactical proficiency and individual fighting skill that genuinely justified their reputation as among the best light infantry soldiers in the world. Ichiki himself was a veteran officer with decades of experience who had been present as a junior officer at the Marco Polo Bridge incident in 1937 that had marked the beginning of full-scale war between Japan and China, and who had spent the years since in command of troops who had fought successfully in every theater where Japanese forces had been committed. He had absolute confidence in his soldiers and absolute confidence in the tactical doctrine that had made Japanese infantry the most feared close combat force in Asia throughout the preceding 5 years of Japanese military expansion, and he approached the coming assault on the American perimeter with the certainty of a man who had never encountered an opponent his doctrine could not defeat. That doctrine was the key to everything that was about to happen, and it was the thing that the American commanders on Guadalcanal had identified as the potential vulnerability that could be exploited if they understood it clearly enough and prepared their defensive positions specifically to counter it, rather than simply setting up a generic defense and hoping that their positions would be strong enough to resist whatever the Japanese threw at them. Japanese infantry tactical doctrine in 1942 was built around the concept of the night assault with cold steel as the decisive form of combat, and the theory behind this doctrine was deeply embedded in the institutional culture of the Japanese army and was supported by an impressive body of practical evidence in the form of successful operations against every opponent Japanese infantry had faced. The doctrine held that Japanese soldiers who were trained to navigate and fight at night, and who were psychologically and physically prepared to close to bayonet range and fight with cold steel, were fundamentally superior to any opponent they could face because the night assault with cold steel removed the technological advantages that industrial societies could bring to bear in daytime conventional combat and reduced warfare to its most basic human elements of courage and will and physical aggression, and in those elements Japanese soldiers had been trained to believe, and had been given practical evidence to believe, that they were superior to any potential adversary, including Americans, who were assumed by Japanese military doctrine to lack the psychological fortitude required to withstand a determined night assault by well-trained Japanese infantry. The intelligence picture that the American commanders on Guadalcanal had available was incomplete in many ways, but it was sufficient to tell them that a substantial Japanese force was moving toward their perimeter and approximately when it was expected to arrive, and the advance warning gave the Marines time to think carefully about the tactical geography of the perimeter they were defending and to identify the specific terrain features that were most likely to be the focus of a Japanese assault. If the Japanese doctrine was applied in the way that doctrine specified, the eastern edge of the American perimeter was defined by a river that on the maps available to the Americans at the time was labeled the Tenaru River, but was actually the Ilu River, and the battle that followed has been known in most historical accounts as the Battle of the Tenaru because of this cartographic error. At the point where the river met the ocean there was a sand spit that was narrow enough to cross on foot without getting more than waist deep in the water, and that sand spit was the feature that defined the entire tactical situation because it was the most obvious crossing point on the eastern side of the American perimeter, and it was the crossing point that a commander following the standard Japanese doctrine of night assault would almost certainly identify as the optimal point of attack. Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Pollock, commanding the 1st Battalion 1st Marines, was the officer responsible for the defensive positions along the Ilu River, and in the days before the Japanese force arrived, he had the opportunity to examine the terrain carefully and to think through exactly how a Japanese assault following standard doctrine would approach and attempt to cross the river, and to design defensive positions that would exploit the specific vulnerabilities that the sand spit created for any force attempting to use it as a crossing point under fire. The sand spit was a lane of attack that was defined on both sides by water and that concentrated any attacking force into a narrow channel that could be covered by fire from multiple positions simultaneously. Pollock positioned his battalion with weapons sighted to create overlapping fields of fire that covered the sand spit from multiple angles, and he placed a 37mm anti-tank gun in a position where it could fire directly down the length of the sand spit at anything attempting to cross it. The 37mm gun, when loaded with canister ammunition, which scattered dozens of steel balls in a wide pattern rather than firing a single solid projectile, was essentially a large shotgun that was catastrophically effective against infantry at close range, and when fired down the length of a narrow sand spit, it covered the entire width of the crossing point simultaneously. He also positioned machine guns in positions that could cover the approaches to the crossing point and the ground on the near bank of the river, where a force that had successfully crossed the sand spit would attempt to reorganize before continuing its assault. And then he did something that required considerable tactical discipline, and that was psychologically difficult for the Marines in the forward positions, who could hear and occasionally see Japanese scouts probing the perimeter in the hours before the main attack. He ordered his Marines not to fire at the Japanese scouts, who were working their way along the perimeter looking for the Marine positions and trying to identify the weakest points in the defensive line, and he enforced this discipline even though individual Marines could see Japanese soldiers moving in the darkness and could have shot them, because he understood that revealing the exact positions and the fire plan of the Marine defensive positions before the main Japanese force was committed to. The crossing would allow Ichiki to adjust his plan and potentially find a crossing point or an approach that was less thoroughly covered and that might allow the Japanese assault to achieve the momentum that their doctrine depended on. The waiting was the hardest part for soldiers in the forward positions who were listening to Japanese soldiers moving in the darkness and who understood what was coming toward them and who had every instinct telling them to open fire and engage the threat they could perceive rather than allowing it to get closer. But the discipline held, and when the main Japanese force finally committed to the crossing, the Marines were ready in a way that a force that had revealed its positions prematurely could not have been, and the tactical advantage that discipline produced in those hours of waiting was a significant part of what made the outcome as one-sided as it turned out to be. What happened after midnight on August 21st, 1942 was the destruction of the Ichiki detachment in a battle that lasted approximately 3 to 4 hours, and that was so completely one-sided in its outcome that it barely qualifies as a battle in the conventional military sense of two forces engaging each other with approximately comparable chances of success. The Japanese force approached the sand spit in column formation, which was the correct tactical approach for moving a large force through the jungle toward an objective at night, but which placed the men in a line that was perfectly oriented for the defensive fire that was waiting for them. When the lead elements of the Japanese force were committed to the crossing, the Marines opened fire with every weapon that was positioned to cover the sand spit simultaneously, and the effect was immediate and catastrophic in ways that the men who were there and who described it afterward found difficult to convey in language that adequately represented what they had witnessed. The 37mm gun firing canister directly down the sand spit hit everything in the crossing lane at once, and the machine guns on the flanks caught the men who survived the initial blast and the men who were trying to push forward from the far bank through the column of soldiers who had already been hit and who were blocking the crossing point. The Japanese soldiers who survived the initial crossing and who made it to the Marine side of the river attempted to do exactly what their doctrine prescribed, because their doctrine was the only framework they had for understanding what to do in this situation, and what it prescribed was to continue pressing forward to close combat range and to fight with cold steel, because that was the phase of combat where Japanese soldiers believed their training gave them the decisive advantage over any opponent. And some of them did close to Marine positions, and the fighting in those positions was brutal and intimate, and there were Marine casualties that were real and that mattered to the men and units that suffered them. But the fundamental problem facing the Japanese force was that their doctrine assumed a set of conditions that the Marine defensive position had been specifically designed to prevent from developing, and the most important of those conditions was achieving sufficient mass at the point of assault to overwhelm the defensive position through sheer numbers and physical momentum. The fire from the Marine positions was preventing enough Japanese soldiers from crossing the river to achieve that mass. And the soldiers who did cross were going into positions that were covered from multiple directions simultaneously, rather than into a defensive line that could be struck at a single point with concentrated force. The engagement lasted until dawn produced enough light to see what the darkness had concealed, and what dawn revealed on the sand spit and on the ground between the river and the Marine positions was a scene that every account written by people who saw it describes in terms of sheer scale and completeness of destruction that clearly affected the men who witnessed it. The Japanese force that had approached the crossing point in the darkness with the confidence of soldiers executing a plan that had worked against every previous opponent had been destroyed as a fighting unit in the space of a few hours in ways that left almost no survivors to withdraw and report what had happened. The surviving elements of the Ichiki detachment who had not been committed to the initial crossing attempt were in the jungle south of the American perimeter, and General Alexander van de Grift, commanding the 1st Marine Division, ordered a flanking movement by a reserve battalion of Marines supported by light tanks to move south and then east through the jungle to get behind the surviving Japanese and cut off any possible line of retreat. The tanks moved along the beach and into the coconut grove, where the surviving Japanese were trying to reorganize, and the combination of tank fire and Marine infantry closing in from multiple directions produced the final accounting of the Ichiki detachment as a military unit. Colonel Ichiki burned his regimental colors rather than allow them to be taken by the Americans, and killed himself in the coconut grove rather than be captured, and his death was entirely consistent with the values that Japanese military culture had instilled in officers of his generation about the absolute prohibition on surrender and the obligation to die rather than be taken prisoner. But there was something additionally significant about the specific manner of his death, which was that a man who had written and transmitted his victory report before the assault began, found himself in a situation that his training and his values and his understanding of what Japanese soldiers were capable of had not prepared him to accommodate, and that he had no framework for addressing in any way other than the one Japanese military culture provided. The numbers produced by the Battle of the Ilu River are the kind of numbers that seem almost impossible when you examine them carefully and without the context that explains how they could be real. Approximately 800 of the roughly 900 men of the Ichiki detachment were killed in the battle and its immediate aftermath against Marine losses of approximately 34 killed and 75 wounded, and a loss ratio of that magnitude does not occur simply because one side fought bravely and the other side fought poorly, or because one side had better equipment, or because one side had the advantage of fortified positions that gave them a degree of protection that the other side lacked. A loss ratio of that magnitude occurs when a tactical system is applied against an opponent who has specifically designed its defensive position to destroy that tactical system at its most vulnerable point, and when the attacking force is committed so thoroughly to its doctrine that it cannot recognize in real time that the conditions that doctrine assumed are not present and cannot adapt its approach in ways that might give it any possibility of success. And the Ichiki detachment was committed to its doctrine in exactly that way because its entire institutional identity and its entire understanding of what made Japanese soldiers superior to their opponents was built on that doctrine, and questioning the doctrine in the moment of its failure was something that the culture and the training and the values of the Japanese army made almost literally impossible. The rigidity of Japanese tactical doctrine in the early phases of the Pacific War was itself the product of the success that Japanese forces had experienced in the years before Guadalcanal, and it illustrates something that is consistently and painfully true about military organizations that have achieved impressive victories using a specific approach. The methods that produce the victories become institutionally sacred in ways that make questioning them feel like a betrayal of the soldiers who died using those methods successfully, and like a rejection of the institutional identity that the victories defined. And the Japanese infantry that charged across the sand spit on the night of August 20th was not being irrational or incompetent by the standards of everything that Japanese military culture had taught it about warfare and about what Japanese soldiers were capable of achieving. The broader consequences of the Battle of the Ilu River extended considerably beyond the immediate destruction of the Ichiki detachment and the removal of 800 Japanese soldiers from the order of battle on Guadalcanal. The battle demonstrated to the American commanders on Guadalcanal and to the broader American military leadership observing the engagement from Hawaii and Washington that Japanese infantry, despite their fearsome reputation and despite their genuine toughness and combat effectiveness, and despite the impressive record of success they had accumulated against every opponent they had faced before August 1942, could be defeated decisively when American commanders understood Japanese doctrine well enough to prepare positions that specifically countered what that doctrine prescribed. This was a psychological shift in the American military's understanding of its opponent that was as important as any tactical lesson, because the reputation of Japanese infantry in August 1942 was such that genuine uncertainty existed within the American military establishment about whether American soldiers had the capacity to stand against Japanese infantry in the specific conditions of close jungle fighting, where Japanese advantages in night combat and cold steel fighting were most pronounced. And the Battle of the Ilu River provided an answer to that question that was unambiguous in every relevant dimension. The 6 months of fighting on Guadalcanal that followed the Battle of the Ilu River were brutal in ways that the battle itself only began to suggest. Japanese naval forces delivered reinforcements to the island repeatedly through a resupply route that the Marines called the Tokyo Express, and the campaign that eventually ended in Japanese evacuation in February 1943 included naval battles that cost both sides enormous numbers of ships and air battles that bled Japanese naval aviation of the experienced pilots it could not replace, and ground fighting in the jungle and on the ridges around Henderson Field that was as sustained and as costly as any the Marines had experienced. But the Battle of the Ilu River remained the foundational moment of the Guadalcanal campaign and of the Pacific War more broadly, because it was the first time that American soldiers had engaged Japanese infantry in the specific conditions where Japanese doctrine claimed to be most effective, and had not merely survived the encounter, but had destroyed the attacking force so completely that the result changed the calculations that Japanese commanders were making about what they could accomplish against American defenders, and changed the expectations that American Marines were forming about what they were capable of doing against Japanese attackers. The Marines who survived the night of August 20th and who fought through the remaining months of the Guadalcanal campaign, and then through the subsequent campaigns at Cape Gloucester and Peleliu and Iwo Jima and Okinawa, carried with them an institutional knowledge about how to fight Japanese infantry that had been earned in the most expensive possible way, and that informed the tactical doctrine the Marine Corps developed for every subsequent operation in the Pacific, and the specific lesson of The Ilu River, which was that Japanese tactical doctrine, could be understood well enough to be specifically countered, and that Marines who prepared their positions with that understanding in mind could destroy Japanese assault forces that the doctrine said should be able to overwhelm any defensive position they attacked, was a lesson that reverberated through the institutional culture of the Marine Corps for the duration of the war. The man who wrote his victory report before the battle and burned his regimental colors when the battle was lost was himself an embodiment of the specific quality that made the Japanese military both formidable and vulnerable in ways that the Americans spent the next 3 years learning to exploit consistently. The absolute commitment to a doctrine and a set of values that produced extraordinary courage and fighting effectiveness in conditions where the doctrine applied but that made adaptation impossible in conditions where the doctrine failed, because the doctrine was not simply a tactical preference, but was the foundation of an institutional identity and a set of values that the entire Japanese military culture had built around the specific methods that had produced Japanese military success over the preceding decade. Understanding that quality in the opponent was the beginning of understanding how to defeat the opponent, and the Battle of the Ilu River on the night of August 20th, 1942 was the moment when that understanding first translated into a tactical result so decisive that its implications for the rest of the war could not be misread by anyone who examined it carefully. Write in the comments which part of this video changed how you understand what happened on Guadalcanal, because I want to know exactly when this stopped being a story about a single night engagement on a jungle island and became a story about the moment the Pacific War turned from a string of Japanese successes into something whose outcome was no longer genuinely in question for anyone who understood what had happened on that sand. Spit in the darkness before dawn on August 21, 1942.